Hello and welcome back to No Bullshit. Today we return to talking about the biggest topic of this year. It's a sad, disturbing, troubling time we're living through right now, but if we stay strong and pull through it together, we're going to make it through this stronger in the end. And since there were a lot of missteps and some mishandlings of things surrounding this crisis, it's also important to remain honest and speak straightforwardly, so that way we can better prevent this from happening to us again, and getting worsened by things like delayed reactions, lies, and panics. But that's where we turn to today's story. Apparently some in the mainstream media are trying to weasel their way out of this problem they may have caused here. We all know the left called Trump racist and dramatic when he started responding to this problem early on back in January. Back then he began banning some travel, particularly from the Far East where this problem began. That's of course what sparked the racist claims thrown against him, coming from the left-wingers of course. Then when Trump made his task force back then too, many in the media scoffed and said he was overreacting and possibly fear-mongering himself. Wow, how far we've come since then. Now it's the left-wingers who are doing this fear-mongering thing like crazy. And also, they're trying to rewrite history on this story too, pretending they were early and on board with this back in January as well. But we all know that wasn't true. And today we have direct evidence that I found online showing they obviously are wrong. For our example of that, let's turn to this clip from MSNBC. Here, Joe Scarborough makes a pretty dubious claim. Check this one out.
Now, we've heard, Zeke Emanuel, that nobody could have seen this coming. The fact is everybody saw this coming. Everybody saw this coming in early January. So I know I know you, like me,
everybody saw this coming in early January, you say? I don't know, Joe. I'm gonna have to call you to task on this one, I think. First of all, almost no one was talking about this seriously in America back then, myself included. Yes, I'm willing to admit that while I heard about things going on overseas then, I didn't see it coming here in this way, at least not by then. But I also am just a YouTuber who uploads commentary videos on my private channel. I'm not a reporter, nor am I claiming we all saw this coming back then either. Joe is though. He's a longtime self-proclaimed journalist making provably false claims live on television. And as Glenn Greenwald says here in this next tweet we're about to share, seems Joe may be a bit of a liar too. Here's the tweet in question where Glenn not only points out Joe's follies, but he seems to have combed through Joe's tweets as well, showing some pretty damning evidence to support the fact that Joe is wrong here. Here are the number of Joe tweets in January sorted by topics. First, the impeachment nonsense took up a whopping 29 tweets. That's almost a tweet per day for the whole month. Pretty ridiculous considering that attempted ousting of our president was based on nothing but lies and exaggerations. Next, the upcoming election got 11 mentions. Nothing much to see there, I guess. And finally, sports got 7 mentions, which wouldn't be a big deal if it weren't for the 0 on the bottom there. That indicates the number of times Joe mentioned this health crisis in January on Twitter. So that means the guy who said we all saw this coming in January, he didn't actually tweet about the thing he saw coming in that month at all. Well, that's rather suspicious, especially considering the other stuff he did tweet about, like sports, which seems far less important. And if he hadn't lied and made that claim on TV, this wouldn't have come up, but apparently Joe Scarborough is some kind of boomer who doesn't realize the internet is forever, and people can easily look back and prove his statements true or false. In this case, false, which is often the case. But Joe Scarborough is only the beginning of today's story. Next, we got another clip. This time, it's got a number of Democrats giving very bad advice back in February, before this outbreak really started to take off. Check this one out.
The risk to New Yorkers is low,
and our city preparedness is high.
This should not stop you from going about your life, should not stop you from going to Chinatown and going out to eat. I'm going to do that today myself.
Come to Chinatown. Here we are. We're, again, careful, safe, and come join us.
Guess we shouldn't be surprised Nancy Pelosi is urging people to go to crowded areas like Chinatown of all places. These Democrats are virtual communists and spokespeople for that terrible Far East nation, who is the source of this problem no less. Now, to be fair, some could see this as me Monday morning quarterbacking this story. Many of us didn't see this level of hysteria coming just a month or two ago. But at the same time, that's why I wasn't giving advice or even commenting on the issue either way. If you don't know or don't have a good take on it, just wait it out and see what happens. Then speak out when it's appropriate and concrete. But these politicians and pundits aren't doing that though. And that's saying a lot of bad things about Nancy Pelosi in particular. I'm not sure who the other two in this video compilation were specifically, but they clearly should have been more cautious as well. They are speaking on television and representing their constituents, all the while passing along very bad information that could have gotten people sick or worse. And it really amazes me how these people are saying go to Chinatown specifically. Kind of reminds me of how we covered that AOC story a few weeks ago, where she said people are being racist for not going to eat at places like that. They're not though. People avoiding those who might be related to the source of this catastrophe are just being cautious. Perhaps too cautious, but do you guys really want to risk your health and life just so you can get some soggy mushu pork or a burnt egg roll or something? Because I don't think I do.
The Department of Sanitation is ready for Mardi Gras 2020.
The facts are reassuring.
We want New Yorkers to go about their daily lives.
But there's really no need to panic and to avoid activities that we always do as New Yorkers. We are a hardy people.
Seems to me that a lot of New York politicians were directly encouraging their people not to worry about this. That's especially troubling for a couple of reasons. First of which is, of course, New York City is the biggest and one of the most densely populated cities in the country. In fact, the only places that are a bit more dense are also in the New York City metropolitan area. This is worth noting too, since, of course, this sickness spreads faster in places like this, where people are closer together and interacting with more people more often. So really, if they were doing this right, the liberals running these big cities, they would actually be getting more cautious early on in order to stave off things prematurely. But instead, they're doing the opposite. And that's why places like New York have become the worst hit by this crisis of all. It's a literal disaster zone there right now. And while I'm not saying the left caused this by any means, but they certainly didn't help. And arguably, their delayed response made things far worse. I also can't believe they were that confident about going through with Mardi Gras earlier in this section. Again, hindsight is of course 2020, but you would think these liberal leaders would at least try and be a little more careful or cautious with what they say on TV. But instead, they're just like, hey, come on down, no worries here. Let's party and rock and roll and eat Kung Pao beef and drink margaritas and shit. This is appalling, and it reminds me how most of the country reacted poorly when many young people refused to cancel their spring break plans a few weeks back. That's how the left and Democrats are looking now when we look back on these old clips.
Americans do not need to panic. What I would suggest, however, is that Americans take this as a wake-up call for seasonal flu.
There's very little threat here. This disease, even if you were to get it, basically acts like a common cold or flu.
So we're telling New Yorkers, go about your lives, take the subway, go out, enjoy life.
Funny how the whole "it's just like the flu" meme has become completely dated now. If you hear anyone still saying that, guys, make sure you run, or at the very least don't listen to them. This also makes you wonder, why were those politicians so keen on keeping people running around anyway? I mean, I don't think it was necessarily early enough to start quarantines or lockdowns yet, but kindly encouraging people to stay home when and if possible wouldn't be too big of a stretch. Instead, we got New York City's Mayor de Blasio saying we should worry more about the flu, when meanwhile, a few weeks later and his town is being ravaged by this insanity from the Far East. Next, you gotta ask, will the people and voters in these big cities ever wisen up to this? Because they've been electing these do-nothing, do-everything wrong Democrats for generations, and all they've managed to do is make their areas worse. Can't blame the conservatives or Trump for that one, really, even though these loons obviously will try their best to.
And certainly not to miss the parade next Sunday. I'm going to be there.
If you had to, would you close down the borders?
No.
Of course he won't. Bernie and Dems love the open borders because they love importing low-income, low-IQ voters from desperate countries down south. That way they can buy their votes with handouts and freebies and keep them on the Democratic plantations for generations. But there is one upside to all of this though. The crisis has shown us how weak and vulnerable these open border Democratic policies truly have made us. If it wasn't obvious that open borders were bad before, well, now that we can see an actual health-affecting threat that's more easily spread because of them, well, that really says a lot. Democrats and socialists like Bernie may still be in denial about this, but they don't matter as much as the American people, who are quickly becoming keen to the situation. We need strong borders more now than ever, and nothing supports that more than Mexico's reactions to this crisis, actually. Our southern neighbors, believe it or not, they dared to make a move to close the border from us, no longer allowing the flow to go the other way. With that said, you really can't deny that closing the borders does help, since we got the likes of Mexico of all people people? Well, they're closing their border to the US now, a border which originally flowed this way for years, until they saw us as a health threat now.
And transmission is not that easy. I think there's been a misperception that coronavirus hangs in the air waiting to catch you. No, it takes direct person-to-person contact.
We also know that if it were likely to be transmitted casually, we would be seeing a lot more cases.
Right, because this is New York. And
Wrong again, Democrats, because now we know the sickness can not only travel by air via coughs or sneezes, but also it can hang and linger on surfaces like seats, doors, handles, railways, packages, food containers, and so on. So knowing what we know now, you'd think these Dems would be apologizing or at least changing tactics, but instead, they're dancing around their failures and trying to justify them and explain them all away. Next, I've got an interesting picture for us to look through to help close this thing out. Here's a compilation of news articles from January and February, mostly consisting of left-wing news reporter hacks downplaying this issue. Sometimes they compare it to the flu again, and other times they try and call the president racist for bringing up this issue's origin. Now for the latter part, just imagine the inverse for a second. If the US accidentally came up with a deadly virus that was spreading around the globe, do you think a foreign country would bend over backwards to defend us? Because I highly doubt the Far East nation this came from would be trying to blame themselves instead of acknowledging the source was the United States. In fact, even when it is their fault, that same nation is still trying to blame the United States. That's why Trump started to identify them specifically to call them out for lying about us. Now imagine what the liberal-run mainstream media in the US would be doing if this problem came from here. Would they be defending us and calling other countries racist for identifying this as an American problem? Hell no. They would be dogpiling on us. And even, they would find a way to blame Trump for this too. And that's because the media, and particularly the left, they hate this country. They're sad little losers who want to destroy us from within. Meanwhile, patriots like Trump and his conservative following like us, we love the United States. So while leftists run for elections because they hate America and they want to destroy us from within, Republicans love our country and we want to make it great again, as we all should. One more point before we go. A lot of people have been talking about Trump's last State of the Union speech again, for a variety of reasons. First of all, Nancy Pelosi made the big mistake of answering a question earlier this week about whether she's been bipartisan recently. She said she was bipartisan at the State of the Union, believe it or not, even though back then she was in the middle of leading an impeachment against Trump, and also that was the time she tore up Trump's speech dramatically at the end of the event. Then people started to realize Trump actually referenced Asia and this growing health crisis coming from there all the way back in February during the State of the Union. And all the while, Pelosi looked like she was zoning out behind him like she could not care less. And also, this picture does a good job of showing the left and right priorities back then too. Here we can see Trump was forming a task force at that time, getting a plan and setting things in motion to fight this problem. Meanwhile, Nancy is handing out impeachment pens, hoping to oust a president based on nothing, a goal which ultimately failed and was a gigantic waste of time and taxpayer money. Now, with that said, which side of the political aisle do you guys want running things here? Because I think America deserves to be led by rational, level-headed, helpful, and sincere right-wingers, as opposed to letting the Dems take the reins, which would mean we would still be open for business right now and spreading the virus like crazy right now too. It may seem bad already at this moment, but just imagine if we didn't start taking precautions early on. If we went with the Dems do-nothing approach, our bad experience with this would be obviously far worse. What do you guys think? Is the media trying to rewrite history here? Was their previous advice really bad too? And do you think they will ever admit they were wrong? Comment your thoughts on everything below, and thanks for watching No Bullshit. Hit that like button to help support this channel, and we'll see y'all next time.